and hopefully most people that have signed up are already in. Welcome everyone to the first book launch of the British Institute at Ankara and I.B.Tauris Turkey monograph series. I'm the lead editor of the series, which is also has an editorial board consisting of Pınar Bedirhanoğlu from Middle East Technical University, Sevgi Adak from the Aga Khan University. We previously, until August, we had Katerina Dallacora from the London School of Economics. She's now left and we're in the process of recruiting someone else. We're very excited to be having our first book launch and starting with Funda Hülagü's Police Restructuring in Turkey, a feminist materialist critique, incredibly timely and empirically rich text, a very important text. Before I introduce her and the talk, I would really just like to give you a little bit of introduction and about the series itself, and also some house rules about the lecture itself. So in terms of this book series, it's the contemporary monograph series, a joint initiative by the British Institute Ankara and I.B.Tauris, as I said, which has a very wide footprint in Middle East and Turkish studies. What I would say distinguishes our series from other series is that we're really trying to emphasize and sort of publish innovative approaches that challenge established ways of examining Turkey. And I think the upcoming publications, including Funda's excellent work, really speaks to that effect. We have another book launch in October titled Architectures of Emergency in Turkey, Heritage, Displacement and Catastrophe. And another publication that is due, I think, early next year, which is on the Arab Alawites of Turkey, and 6 more currently publications that are under contract, including on education reform in Turkey, to looking at political violence in the 1970s. So a very rich selection of texts that are coming through from great young breed of academics, a new generation of scholars. So I also want to let you know that you can, there is a 35% discount on BIAA titles from I.B.Tauris for BIAA members. So I think that details of that can be seen on the poster. And before I pass everything on to Funda and introduce her, I just want to let you know that the video, there's a video being recorded and then live streamed on YouTube, and it'll be saved on the web. You can, and the audience videos and audios are default, are turned off by default, and that you can use the Q&A functions to the button to ask questions during the lecture, and we will pass that on to the speaker, or the speaker will be able to see those questions. And as I said, please do feel free to introduce yourself through the chat feature. Okay, so on to today's talk. Funda Hülagü, just as a brief introduction, is on the teaching staff at the University of Marburg, Germany. She has published several articles in journals such as Science and Society, and various German titles that I cannot read very well. She's one of the co-editors of the recently published book, Turkey's New State in the Making, Transformations in Legality, Economy and Coercion. And with that, I would like to pass on the floor to Funda. and mute myself. And Funda, you have the floor. And we will continue a Q&A following Funda's talk.
Many thanks, Ceren. So I will be sharing my screen with all of the participants, to whom I deeply thank for making their time to sit through this presentation. And yeah, I will just right away start and appease my nervousity as well a little bit. So, okay, here is my screen. I hope it works. Good. But does it function? Yes. So, from 10 years ago, from this day on, it was again a fall day in September. I was again very nervous because I was waiting my viva, my PhD defense. And it was again on the reform issue, about the policy reform issue. I don't know if this is the coincidence or whatever. But I have, before starting and ongoing with this talk, I would like to share my greatest thanks with a few amazing people, like whose support is the reason like I'm up here right now. It's Pınar Hoca, first of all, Pınar Bediranoğlu. I would like to deeply thank for her all support, and as well as Ceren and other editorial members who supported me along this process. What I did in my book, in this book of mine, and what's going on, why I am so much obsessed with the idea of policy reform and the process of policy reform, in fact. Because I have been, for the last 10 years, I have been pretty much occupied by different aspects of this process, including the police violence in the Kurdish region in Turkey, but also including police violence against politically active women, about the neoliberal aspects of policy reform, about the international actors who are involved into the policy reform process. But this time I tried to bring another perspective, which I think also helped me to broaden my horizon as well on the nature of the state in Turkey. So this book, what does this book do? Basically, it introduces a new relational perspective, where I try to analyze the policy-making process of this process in Turkey from three different entry points. So in other words, I do not only focus on the immediate owners of the reform process, which is basically the police bureaucracy itself, the state bureaucracy itself, but rather I try to make sense of this process within a holistic perspective, because different actors were involved actually in this process, including several international actors, for example, UNDP, UNFPA, but also the Democratic Armed Forces, the Geneva Center for Democratic Armed Forces. But also feminists, many different feminist organizations and women's rights organizations were also somehow involved into the making of this police reform process in Turkey. So what has happened during this process? What a focus on these different actors tells us about the fate of this process, let me say. Besides, I use a state theoretical approach. And why I use a state theoretical approach, it's a deliberate decision, I would say, because I want to take a distance from theories of political regime change and transformation, which is fine. Like I know many of them. There are lots of good studies and very accurate studies done within this perspective. But I have some problems with this argument about authoritarian turn. So here I would like to be a little bit polemical. And I say there is no authoritarian turn, but rather what happened in Turkey is that the state maybe differed, but while remaining identical. So I wanted to show that policy reform process was not just a cosmetic process, where the state owners of the state, whatever, rulers of the state, or you can tell them different groups, including AKP itself, they didn't do as if policy reform was implemented, especially like what is understood from policy reform, this liberal process of so-called democratization was implemented. But the outcomes were not as expected as we would normally, right? So therefore, I think there is no authoritarian turn. However, there's a dialectical sublation, there's a metamorphosis, if you want. especially before and after Gezi, I would like to say, Gezi protests. And I think a basic argument, the basic objective of this book is to show this dialectical transformation like in between these two periods, before and Gezi protests, and to show how the moralist policing, the moralist philosophy of policing, which was implemented during the police reform process in Turkey, has evolved, has metamorphosed into a full-blown virtuous violence in Turkey. What I try to say by these two concepts, what is moralist philosophy of policing indeed? Well, long story cut short maybe, here I can go more into details. If we have time, I will see. Moralist philosophy of policing is the idea that, well, there's a huge social question in Turkey, but the police cannot resolve this question, this social question. What can the police do is to give back the dignity to populace. What does this mean exactly? This meant at the time that the society in Turkey was so much harmed by the Kemalist state that the police, what can the police do is to give back this lost dignity to the people itself. So kind of a populism, maybe you can entitle it, or kind of a localism. These are different perspectives, but I combine both, and I don't know if I will have time to tell more about this. But in short, moralist philosophy of policing actually was a specific kind of political Islamist perspective about state and society and the role of the police. And basically, this has transformed, updated itself, evolved itself into a full-blown virtuous violence. And by the notion of virtuous violence, I try to convey the idea that as this perspective of that there was a harmonious society which was harmed by a Kemalist state, and therefore we should, like the police should help the society to restore to its origins, to its authenticity. After Gezi, what we see, the police process and the policing idea within the state, and akin to the also AKP cadres as well, started to argue that, well, it's not only the Kemalist state which harms the society, there are other groups which are harming the society, which are disturbing its authentic structure. So we should be able to differentiate between them. So maybe we will not be differentiating between the state and the society as such, no, but we will be selecting certain groups, we will be deselecting some other groups. So this can be described as virtuous violence, maybe. I will come more into the details of this in a couple of minutes, hopefully. And how I try to show all this transformation and how I try to show this continuity, actually. But I try to display this continuity and this metamorphosis with an exclusive focus on the question of gender in Turkey, especially the gender-based violence. But I understood this notion of gender-based violence not only as in relation to the domestic violence, in relation to the violence against women in public sphere, but I included also within that gender-based violence issue the state violence, gender-based state violence. So within a broader perspective, I tried to understand this difference and similarity before and after Gezi with a focus on gender, and to show the discontinuity, discontinuity and this evolution from moralist philosophy of policing to gender-based virtuous violence. So, but today's talk, I don't want to all here tell all the arguments, I share with you all my arguments about the police reform process in Turkey, which my book especially dealt with the period from 2004 to approximately from 2004 to 2014. But we should be aware of the fact that Turkey has underwent series of police reforms, actually, and it's coming, another one, I'm sure about it. So more or less, today or tomorrow in the short term, or maybe a medium term, I don't know, another police reform we will be facing another one. So therefore, in today's talk, I want to invite you to actively think with me, if it would be really nice, what is to be done next time when we are faced with a police reform. Maybe we should be the owners of this police reform this time, I don't know. But My idea is to a little bit relativize and give a more historical background to the police reform idea and process in Turkey. When we just go back till 1980s, we can even see that the first police reform in Turkey has happened during the military dictatorship of this 1980 to 1983, during this military junta era. And it's interesting, it was not a story specific to Turkey. The military junta actually tried to adapt a very global process, which was the process of this transition from Keynesian policing to neoliberal policing around the globe, especially in Britain also, for example. And what we see is that the military junta was obsessed by the idea that we should isolate, quote unquote, we should isolate police forces from populace. So society, especially the leftist groups, have a tremendous impact on the making of the police cadres. So we should isolate the police from society as much as possible, and we should militarize it and strengthen it. So this was the first idea, the first police reform process understood or told as, or documented as, the modernization of police forces in Turkey. A second reform process has happened just in the mid of 1990s, when there was a quote unquote civil war in Turkey, right? And it's interesting, this was also very much in line with the global transformation. By that time, many epistemic communities around the world started to argue that, well, globalization is fine, but there are also waves of counter-globalization, including, for example, human trafficking. So how we will be dealing with these kinds of quote-unquote unwanted processes of globalization? We should be able to have a better security bureaucracy who can make sense of these new transformations, new happenings, new developments. So we should be able to educate a new generation of police as police intellectuals. So this was the moment or period also, for example, we see the institutionalization of new police institutions, let me say, or new security institutions around the world. We see that a tremendous amount of police officers or chiefs go, for example, for a PhD and try to make sense of this new quote-unquote security threats. So we can say that this era can be understood as this era of reforming the police in order to foster police science. So, and the third era, which is also the topic or the subject matter of my book, is the era that I would call is the human security era. So this human security notion, which has become commonplace, the common sense to many epistemic communities again around the world, who argued that, okay, we have to reform the police because of two issues. The first one was the idea that, well, we have to get rid of the legacy of Cold War over the security apparatus, especially we have to get rid of the Cold War type of security apparatus in the post-Soviet sphere, in the Eastern Europe. So there was a tremendous impact, focus or underlining of what is to be done with the newly post-socialist states there, what kind of a state there should be. And the second is post-conflict states, especially in places like Yugoslavia, but also in other places, where there was a transition from this fully conflict-laden periods to a post-conflict phase. Again, the question was, what kind of a state? And during this era, you see this idea that that the police forces should embrace human security. But what is this? I will go more into the details. What is meant by this? I will go more into the details. But before going more into the details of this process, maybe I should share with you a couple of questions which animate also me since I completed writing this book. So because I think at one point it is very legitimate to say, okay, this much of analysis, but so what? So therefore my strategy, both for today, but from now on also in my life, it's like, what should be our own lessons learned from this process, for example? What kind of reforms are non-reformist reforms? Because if reforms are so problematic, But if we still need kind of reforms, then what kind of reforms are non-reformist reforms? How to imagine new forms of public power? How should we be restructuring the police, but also the entire criminal justice system? And I'm sure some of you would maybe hesitate to, like, who is we? Well, I have to be open. So it's like this book is written from a perspective which values concrete utopias. So it's not a utopian book at all, but it is written from a perspective from where I stand, and I stand, of course, from place which does not reduce human beings to immediate necessities, so which does not therefore ask for human security, but more concrete utopias. So the critique, the resources of the critique. But I have to give you also a couple of more questions to also make sense of where I stand, because feminist materialist critique is a very ambitious project, and I'm not sure if I even could fulfill its needs, but I attempt to do so, and I think certain questions have to be answered commonly, but also especially with those feminists who try to develop this project. Most of the feminists, of course, this is also the ontological raison d'être of feminism, maybe. They see the political world, especially, from the perspective of the most disadvantaged. So this is obvious, right? This is the case with many of the critical theories. But I want to underline that I deliberately take a distance from understanding this, seeing the political world from the perspective of the most disadvantaged as an ethical stance. It's not that I'm an unethical person, of course, but whenever we undermine this position, the standpoint of the most disadvantaged to an ethical call, it ends by depoliticizing certain processes. I mean, politics becomes subsumed under ethics, which might be fine for many, but which is, I think, problematic in many ways. I will clarify in a minute why. Therefore, I think that this standpoint of the most disadvantaged should be understood as an epistemological perspective rather than an ethical perspective. What I mean by that, just be clearer even. I start my own book with reference to the murdering of Selectivities, maybe. This was the experience which impacted me a lot, because at the time I was also reading and writing about the police transformation, and the shutting down of Selectivities was a question which I guess which has been mentioned a lot here and there by many people in different aspects. But Selectivities was neither murdered because she was a woman, nor she was murdered because, quote unquote, she was a terrorist. Anything happened in between, anything happened at this interaction of gender and the political stance. So, however, we tend to underestimate this holistic experience, but only focus to certain aspects of this experience. And whenever we develop our critique, we depoliticize. So, and I totally understand sometimes this political reaction to, or how would I say, this mode of giving an ethical outlook to the process rather than politicizing it, because it has its own problems, I can imagine. But nevertheless, we cannot focus only at the gendered outcomes if we want to make sense of the gendered structures. And many of the feminist critiques of the state, especially, tend to focus at the gendered outcomes at the expense of the gendered structures. I will come back to this issue as well. And all in all, I think this epistemological issue does also invite us to be more courageous when we formulate this standpoint of the most disadvantaged. We cannot reduce the standpoint of the most disadvantaged to their immediate needs. This would be doing an injustice to the political characteristics of the conflicts of valorization in Turkey. I will clarify what I mean in a minute. So all in all, a feminist materialist critique for me is beyond an ethical stance. It's an epistemological discussion. Why it is so, I think now it will become clearer. One of the conclusions of my book is that we can no more go with the concept of human security. Maybe many of you don't do it, so because it's not the most popular concept at all. But I should tell you that for the last couple of years, this concept started to appear here and there, and even in places I was not expecting at all, as an oppositional concept. But first, let me be very clear on, give you 3 reasons why this concept is very problematic. First, it's because of its dichotomic structure. It is based on an understanding of human security versus state security. And just an example from the police reform process in Turkey, what has this caused? Because human security understanding was also adopted by the reformist police cadres themselves in Turkey. And this has caused to something which is really unacceptable. The idea that the male perpetrators of violence against women are victims of the Kemalist state come modern society was posited in such a way that as these male perpetrators of violence against women were themselves victims of a Kemalist society, Kemalist state, reformist police cadres argued that we cannot apply judicial policing in these cases. We should apply administrative policing, meaning that we should be caring for restoring their dignities. We cannot criminalize them. So this dichotomic structure of understanding human security versus state security and replacing it, of course, interpreting it and translating it to the context of Turkey, created a kind of a process which, like immunity, legitimated itself. Impunity legitimated itself. Another reason why human security is so problematic, also one of the conclusions of my book, is that, well, it is really anti-secular, or in some cases, maybe post-secular, but for sure, it is including, and the human of human security is not a homo politicus. And this is not specific to Turkey. This is not specific to this or that post-conflict country or whatever post-Soviet country. This has been becoming a part of the agenda, or not agenda, but part of the development of the global regime of women's rights, unfortunately, especially in the beginning of 2000s. And we see that at that period, women's reintroduction to the state building processes was conditional on the fact that they are victims of war, for example. They are victims of violence. So getting access to the political field, as long as you are a victim, this is undermining your humanity to something below homo politicus. So, and what has caused this furthermore, this anti-secular or post-secular positionality, is we see that there is a rise of behavioralist turn. So rather than asking public policies, like developing public goods, we see that many civil society organizations started to rally around the ideas of, for example, training the men in the state so that they adjust their behaviors, their attitudes towards these victims. But there is also many researchers underline this, especially with regard to this human security issue. This has ended up in recreating or upgrading or developing new masculinist protectionalism, a new patriarchal protectionalism. So, and the third reason why I think human security cannot be sustained or cannot become an oppositional perspective, including, of course, the feminist politics, I think, because also this is one of the results or conclusions of my research process, which I ended here. I have seen that human security has created an epistemic fallacy, meaning that it created a false cooperation between the political classes and the feminist organizations and women's rights organizations. What I mean by that, it's kind of created it acted like a blinder. despite the discrepancy between the projects of the political classes and the feminist movement, this discourse of human security, this reframing of every security demand, protection demand, the idea of due diligence, that the state should protect its citizens, with reference to the notion of human security, harmonize normally unharmonizable processes or unharmonizable demands and perspectives. I will come back to this issue. But here I want to underline something else. But how was that so easily done? How this epistemic fallacy was so easy? Why human security ended up becoming a blinder, especially for the feminist movement? Well, my research also, of course, within the limitedness of it, right, showed me that for the last 30 years, nearly so, the feminist analysis, there's a retreat from state analysis in feminist politics and in feminist analysis, let me say, in feminist research, scholarly research. And at one point, it is understandable, this retreat from state analysis, because what is the main argument of this retreat is the idea that, well, we can no more assume a holistic state, a monolithic state. State is not a monolithic block. So therefore, we cannot act as if we should be fighting against a state. We can recuperate some of the institutions of the state to advance a woman's struggle against patriarchy. This was the idea. And it's fine to some extent. But the problem is that although I agree with the idea that the state is not a monolithic block, of course, it's not. There are different institutions, there are different, of course, interests within those institutions. We have seen in Turkey that there was a state crisis created within the institutions, between different institutions of the state. That's okay. But is really state, can we leave the state analysis aside? Can we really easily recuperate the state in order to advance gender equality, for example? Is it that easily be done? Here I have an objection. And therefore, as I have an objection, and I tried in this book to come up with an eclectic reading of many different state theories, so that maybe we can sort out the beginnings or initial steps of a feminist materialist theory of state, which can maybe help us to go further ahead when we are faced with another policy reform process. To do what? To see how to analyze the process. And explaining, or how would I say, lecturing on a state theory is not that easy, and it's easy. I think I don't want to take this risk of being too boring, but nevertheless, I beg your attention so that I can share with you some 3 basic concepts I think which can help us to make better sense of the policy reform process in Turkey, both for the past experiences, but also for the upcoming future, let me say. The first concept which I use is this concept, which is not mine, of course, but I freely interpreted it. So I'm not sure if Bob Jessup would agree with me. But this concept used by Bob Jessup, this is the gender selectivities of the state. Why I say that I freely interpreted it? Because different from Bob Jessup, who is very much a voluntarist in this aspect, I think there are still some structural determinations, structural conditions which impact the gender selectivities of the state. What are those? So basically, very basically, I know, and we won't maybe be able to go into the details, but I understand from state in a capitalist society is that it has to reproduce the capitalist society. The state has to reproduce a capitalist society. And what is a capitalist society? It is a society ridden with conflicts of valorization. So whose labor and whose body is more valuable than the other ones? This is, I think, very basic to a feminist understanding of the state. This conflicts of valorization So whose body and whose labor? Actually, they are not even separate because labor is embedded already. So labor doesn't exist in void, it's already embodied. So whose body, whose labor? These constant conflicts of valorization push or put the state in such a state that it should select from this wider field of structural necessities. It should take certain strategic actions. It should select certain groups of people rather than the other groups. It should select certain women, not the other group of women, and it should try to it ends up by using gender itself as a governmental apparatus. Gender divisions, gender difference, but also gender knowledge, ends becoming a governmental apparatus at the hands of the state, which tries to deal with these conflicts of valorization somehow. Sometimes resolving these conflicts, some other times recreating new conflicts, of course, by the state and through the state. So an example from the reform process. During the reform process, so to make sense of gender selectivities, what I mean by that, gender selectivities of the state. During the reform process, violence against women was one of the most important topics for the police reformers. They wanted to deal with this issue really deeply, because they even thought that this impacted the resolution, or how would I say, not the resolution, but maybe this has a serious importance in order to be able to solve also the Kurdish question for them. For the police bureaucracy, violence against women was a central question. If you remember the beginning of 2000s, we were discussing, or at the time, Turkey was discussing honor crimes, called so-called honor crimes. So interestingly, the state insists to define violence against women as a social question, for example, different from the feminist movement, which tries to define violence against women as a political question. The state underlines that this is a social question, which is caused by rapid modernization of society, and arguably for the reformist police cadres, so poor men, they have to migrate to urban contexts, and they do things they wouldn't do normally if they had stayed in their own urban, rural areas. So they lose status when they migrate, and they do things that they shouldn't do, and they risk to become rebels. They risk to become a mob. So what is the role of the police? The role of the police is to restore the dignity of this poor man. So this is a gender selectivity. This is a specific way the social question is read by the state and how the gender selectivity functions. But we should also be aware of the fact that this poor man category is also created by the state itself, constructed by the state itself. I will come back to this issue if I have time more in the close future. Another issue, political violence, gender-based state violence, for example. At the end of the 1990s, this was also a period of significant state violence against women, especially if you remember the 19 December. Women involved in political violence are also analyzed by the state. And state actors, the reformist police cadres, who even wrote books on this issue, for example, and they argued that, well, some women are radicalized and they join political violent organizations because of familial neglect. And they come to the conclusion that this is the case almost for the young Kurdish woman. However, they also made another, there's also PhD dissertation on this, for example, written by one of the then reformist police figures, arguing that, well, but on the contrary, for the case of the Alawi women living in the outskirts of Istanbul, the story is different. They are not radicalized because of the familial neglect, but they are radicalized because of familial ties. So, for example, the state started to develop different strategies for different groups of women, for coming from different origins or different social groups, let me say. And therefore, gender selectivities of the state is not about just men and women, it's also about women and women. which women are protected and how and why, which women should be de-radicalized and why and how. And the idea that this cannot be left to judicial policing. For the police reformers, judicial policing is false. It's based on criminalization. It's based on penalization. However, the reform process should advance administrative policing, meaning this moral policing, meaning like creating the harmonious society, giving the society its harmonious origins back. A second concept that I use also in my book to make sense of the police reform process is the concept of non-event or non-events. I also freely interpret this concept, but I take it from Klaus Offe. And I'm not sure I've seen the name of Veysi Hoca, if he is here, still here. And I remember back in Canada when I was, I don't know, 31 or 32, he was the first who introduced me this Klaus Offe, actually. Thanks, Hoca. So, and this notion of non-event, what is this non-event? Klaus Offe argues that, well, in order to make sense of capitalist state, we cannot just understand the state as if it's a state in a capitalist society. We should understand that the state is a capitalist state. So this is different from a state in a capitalist society. So there has been like different states around the history, and the states always dealt with conflicts of valorization, and this doesn't make them immediately a capitalist state. Offe argues that from a very political position, argues that if you want to make sense of what is capitalist state, you should be able to show its political boundaries. What are the events which should never happen in a capitalist state? What are the limits, political boundaries of a capitalist state? These define the capitalist state. And I think we can reinterpret this Offian stance with reference to two non-events. And I argue that the political boundaries of a capitalist state is made up of two non-events. The first non-event is subversion, and the second non-event is state failure. So the state should neither explode nor implode. What I mean by that? So 30 years ago, we would maybe be talking about socialist revolutionary transformation, which is the more immediate threat for the capitalist state. It doesn't exist anymore. But this doesn't mean that subversion is still the political boundary of the capitalist state. On the contrary, it has been reinterpreted. And the security sector reform process is this reinterpretation of the non-events, actually. Which events should never happen so that this state can reproduce itself? Security sector reform has been a very effective process of reinterpretation, non-event reinterpretation. What events should never happen so that these states could be reproducible? And each of these non-events and how they are governed by the state make them to bring the state to bring to the table certain new gender-based selectivities or gender selectivities of the state, right? So, for example, the principle of anti-subversion, which is mean basically that who is ruled, who should be ruled by the state in a society, who should be governed actually, who is the object of state power in a society, who should be, which social transformation should never happen in a society. Meaning that this question immediately brings us into the brink of new gender selectivities, like, is women's politicization beneficial to the socioeconomic order and the political order? Which women's politicization is beneficial, when and how and under what conditions? So this is a very historical and specific process. This is not predefined, but the boundaries are predefined. So, however, the question itself is very flexible, and it is left to the various state cadres, reformist police cadres, to interpret it for them, which women's politicization were no-go, for example. And the other issue is the principle of anti-failure, so the question of who rules and which kind of reforms are acceptable? Because the idea is that, okay, we will never let the subversion go and take over the state, but we cannot say no to every demand for reform. Which reforms are acceptable so that the state doesn't fail? And then another question comes, for example, to the table, which again makes the state and the police reformers ask this question. Should the policing of the domestic violence, for example, be centering on the victim or on the offender? Who shall be the recipient subject of state protection? Should the offender be penalized, or should we help the victim? These necessarily do not happen at the same time. Most of the time, states choose one of those. They either criminalize the offender or they help the victim. I have never seen that both of them happen. Well, I don't know. Sorry, it has been already, I think, much. But I will finish in a couple of minutes. Sorry. After the Gezi, why I give this example? I guess Gezi is the utmost important, like it illustrates the non-event, the perfect non-event in the short history of Turkey, in the historiography and the historiography of Turkey. It has been the non-event. And you can follow up, for example, the new internal security law, which came after the Gezi and which referred to the Gezi as that one which should never repeat itself again. And interestingly, the women protesters signified for the police during the Gezi and after the Gezi a challenge like no others. Even during the Gezi uprisings, you see that the women protesters are quote unquote called like Assad's puppets, for example. Many other ugly and words that I won't use here and issues. And after that time, for example, during the same time, the state called the Esnaf under arms. And arguing, and the state became much more open about its particularistic structures, let me say. But in order to recalibrate the valorization process, the state deepened the patriarchal selectivity. By mean that certain women become subjected to state violence and its utmost ugliest forms. However, at the same time, the same state introduced during the same days, for example, dowry contribution, in order to be able to convince certain women to the merits of the socioeconomic order. So this selective patriarchy or the patriarchal selectivity has been very much deepened since the Gezi event, I would say. And the third concept, which I use in my book to make sense of this process, is especially in relation to the feminist interventions to this reform process itself. And I use the concept of power effects, which I take from Elizabeth Prugel, again, a political economist, feminist political economist. And in short, I won't go very much into the details. The idea is that feminist interventions to the state and in the state cannot write on the state as a blackboard, as a whiteboard, as if it's a tabula rasa, as if it's a whiteboard. They are filtered. And I argue that each feminist intervention is filtered by the gender selectivities of the state. And they are not only filtered by the gender selectivities of the state, there is a range of power effects between these encounters with the feminist interventions and the state. And within these encounters, we see that sometimes the feminist interventions are like refused. Sometimes they are fully co-opted. But I think the most significant one for us in the case for policy reform is the resignification. It's interestingly, the state was able to resignify, repurposify, give a new shape, whereas taking them as such, these feminist interventions. And this is, I think, one of the things that we should be very much caring when, during the future policy reform processes. Which kind of feminist interventions are resignified by the gender selectivities of the state? I will give you a couple of examples, because there are lots of different interventions, modes of interventions into the police during this reform process. We don't have much time to go in each of details. It's in my book. If you are, of course, interested, you are very welcome. But let me give you, for an example of these governance interventions. So certain groups, especially certain feminist organizations, were training the police. Like feminist tutors were training the police, especially in relation to the gender-based violence. What happened during this training process? We see that, for example, there's an underlining of the idea that the police should adapt its behaviors, should change its behaviors to help the woman subjected to domestic violence. And this has been taken by the state, by the police reformers, in order to upgrade their legitimation, by arguing that, of course, as long as they are victims, we can help certain women, not all of them, because also the state is powerless to some extent. This is a social question, the state cannot solve it. But as long as they are victims, we are here, we can adjust our behaviors, we can be more protectionist, we can be more blah, 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 blah. So, however, when asked to these feminist tutors themselves, of course, they were underlining that they never wanted the police to see the woman as victims of domestic violence or to victimize women as such. But there was a kind of resignification, and it was not that difficult to do this resignification, because there is the gap between the idea of due diligence, that the state should protect its citizens, and the human security understanding of the police reformists. There was something going on, a kind of a resignification process, which couldn't be prevented by feminist interventions and true feminist interventions. So, all in all, what I try to say is this: but at the end of the policy reform process, I can give you like a lot of other examples, like tremendous amount of examples. What I come to as a conclusion, I come to the idea that, well, we are no more in an era of modern state form, which means that this modern state acted always with a gap, right? There is this universal law, and there is this practical implementations, and feminists always try to intervene into this gap between the norm, between the ideal of the modern state, the idea that everybody is equal before the law, therefore women citizens of a state can profit from or benefit from this universal law, and this practice which is imperfect, which should be perfect, which we should perfectionize. And this beneficial gap between the ideal and the actual of the modern state has disappeared completely, I think, as a result of this reform process in Turkey, not only in Turkey, all over the world. And what we ended in is this centaur state, which means that this state's political foundation is differential treatment. So it never argues that there's a universal law. However, the implementation is not perfect. So we should just always strive towards this norm of universal equality before the law, for example. This gap has disappeared. And the centaur state is a state which openly and obliquely says, and also legalizes, the idea that differential treatment should be the new norm. So then my conclusion, if this is the case, what kind of a public power do we want to build really? How should we avoid being subalternized by the ruling powers? How to get out of the parameters of political resistance, which do focus on fragmented experiences? What is state indeed for feminism? What should it be? Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Funda, for that theoretically extremely rich and eclectic presentation. I will now open up for Q&As. Please, everyone, if you could use the Q&A function, and I will then relay the questions back onto Funda. But before I do that, I have some questions raised when I was reading your book, which a little bit perhaps off, the specific theoretical framework. But I wanted to ask about sort of the police reforms. You identify the kind of different eras of reforms, and you focus more on the 2004 to 2014 period. And you talk in your book about how in the post-80s period there was this restructuring the police force of sort of more the rightist cadres of society. What prior to the 1980s would we say that in terms of your research, a bit more pluralistic, perhaps, police force and ideologically, and where does sort of Islamist ideology fit within the reform process?
Okay. Actually, I didn't use in my book explicitly the literature which is trying to analyze or define political Islam. But if asked from outside of the confines of the book, I would easily say that the moral politic understanding implemented or developed during the reform process is itself a political Islamist kind of policing in Turkey. It does not have direct references to Islam as such. I mean, Islam as a religion as such, of course, because it's something else. It's political Islam, and as political Islam has always been interested in the idea of state and what's to be done towards the state. What is state indeed? We see that many of the reformist policy cadres were very much interested about this issue of the state and how to behave towards the state. For example, should we bow our heads even if there is an illegitimate ruler? How should we behave towards the state? Is state sacrosanct, or should we also try to eliminate those corrupt rulers from being ruled? These questions are tremendously dealt with these reformist policy cadres, who were arguing on two grounds. The first, as I told you, the idea that the state should be restored to its authentic origins, which is this a state society together, like a harmonious society where state does only the job of harmonizing or bettering or perfectioning the harmonious society itself. And this is, I think, very much a political Islamist understanding of state-society relations. But besides that, we can just be more empirically to the point. Many of the policy cadres were themselves from Gülenist sect, I would say. Many of them were have been since then have been disappeared from scene. And therefore, many of the books written by those policy cadres are not anymore published or are not maybe used by the state as such directly, since especially the putsch attempt. But nevertheless, during the time these cadres were developing this moral philosophy understanding, I guess they were not representing only the Gülenist sect at all. I mean, that wasn't the case, if you ask my idea. It wasn't a partial understanding of political Islam. I think it was pretty much appreciated by the current rulers of Turkey's state, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess I would ask, just until we're waiting for questions, I'll ask one further question, which is, how about the sort of the post 2016 era? Can we see a following on from sort of the period that you discuss in your book, any sort of material change in terms of the cadres of the police force, the types of reforms or policies implemented, especially with the kind of the kind of transformation that was going on and the purges that followed 2006, the failed coup attempt. I ask, I mean, I know you don't want to touch on the sort of regime change, regime type focus, but in the Middle East, of course, you see this the classic trajectory of the development of the states is, you have the coup leaders, and then they want to coup-proof the state and their rule. So they have this massive internal security forces. Eventually, internal security forces, the police forces, become a lot more powerful than the military and turn into a police state. I mean, Egypt is a classic case of this, of course. And in 2011, the military sees an opportunity to step back into the game, essentially. I guess my question is the extent to which post 2016 we see this kind of pattern developing in the case of Turkey.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Many thanks for this very important question. Well, I can immediately say a couple of things, but I need more research probably to complement what I will say now. But to my knowledge and my research has shown that some certain departments within the police organization has come to the fore during the latest time, especially since 2016, this 15th July putsch attempt. And this one, basically the eye-catcher department is the Special Police Operations Department. So and this department is not anymore a department as such. It acquired a new status within the organizational scheme of the Director General, the Security Director General of Turkey. So it acquired a new meaning. It has its own now regulations, which are pretty much autonomous from the other regulations of binding the other departments. And on top of it, I think this is also very interesting. Special operations teams, they recruit more and more women. And it's not only of course, the majority of them are still men and etc. But I think what differs and what is interesting to make sense is that more and more women are recruited by special operations teams. And this creates a really, how would I say, controversial development in many regards. I mean, these women are mostly recruited in order to show that women can become avengers, actually. So that the idea that women will be avenging, how would I say, it's from the quote unquote, what they say, the woman will be avenging because of the deaths incurred to the police brothers in the previous period in the hands of, for example, PKK or so on and so forth. So this development, I think, should be carefully analyzed because it gives its new characteristic to the regime as well, I think, and its controversial characteristic to the regime. And this is also very similar in many regards. For example, the recent turn in Egypt, where you see, for example, the recruiting of more and more women to the rank and file, police rank and file, so that they punish on the spot those people on the street who are harassing women, like men in the street who are harassing women. So this patriarchal protectionism, this masculinist protectionism is very, these human security states are very controversial. So they are not they operate through different gender selectivities, as I was trying to explain, and special operations departments, and police and rank and file has changing its outlook lately. Yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much. We have a question from Pınar Bedirhanoğlu. She says, can you elaborate a bit more what you mean by the transformation of the modern state towards one with differential treatment? And do you agree with the arguments on the neo-feudal state, for instance? And with what sort of implications on gender relations?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, actually, I also forgot to mention that the centaur state is actually, I take it from Loïc Wacquin, a French renowned criminologist, or let me say critical criminologist, who was trying to make sense of the developments in France, actually. And he started to observe the state in France and discovered that, well, the state has been really functioning along two different rationalities. The first rationality was governing in liberal terms the upper classes, and governing in very authoritarian terms the proletarian classes, let me say. And he ended by arguing that this is not anymore how would I say, a shy process which is trying to disguise itself, arguing that no, this is not the case. No, it's very open process, and therefore this is my interpretation of it. He argues that we are going really away from the Republican tradition in France, for example, Republican tradition of statehood, and the political foundations of the state do change. And I think we can I strongly agree with Loïc Wacquin on this issue, and I think this centaur state can be rethought concerning it's, of course, these Western credentials are a bit problematic because we can introduce a lot of different other aspects to it, because he, for example, doesn't adopt a gender aspect or gender perspective at all. But nevertheless, I think this centaur state also, it's an allegory. It's like this creature, half of it is a human, half of it is a horse. Like, so therefore, these two faces of the same creature, dealing with different social groups, with different, along with different traditions, state power mechanisms, legal solutions, so on and so forth, and even without legal solutions. It was the same in the police reform process, the idea that we cannot anymore wait judicial processes. The police should solve the social question immediately on the spot by administrative policing. We cannot leave it to the criminalization processes. I think this is a similar mentality. I think the state should be agile and adaptable so that it deals on spot with every issue and according to the requirements of this or that group. If this is a kind of neo-feudalism, I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know. Well, it's interesting, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Sevgi Adak, she says, thanks, Funda, for the theoretically rich presentations and congratulations on the book. Could you please elaborate more on what you mean when you say the type of the feminist intervention does not matter because all interventions are filtered by the gender selectivities of the state?
Oh, no, it's if I said so, I'm sorry. So I tried to say that the mode of feminist intervention differs a lot, but they are all filtered by the gender selectivities of the state in different ways. So certain modes of feminist interventions are repurposified, resignified. However, other forms of state interventions, feminist interventions are distorted, for example. Just give you an example, especially from the anti-militarist feminist interventions to the state during this reform process. It was argued mostly that, especially on the basis of the calicoes in the southern Turkey, I would say, it was argued that these calicoes, these forms of militarized police centers, are threatening women's everyday life because of, like, there are many men, and these policemen are like how kind of say, making life even worse for those women who cannot get out easily because they don't want to see like just come face to face with these policemen. And they argued that this is the state does this purposefully. The state should recognize women's needs, everyday life's needs. Women speaks the language of everyday life, and the state should recognize this. This was the intervention of, for example, anti-militarist feminism. And the state distorted this, for example, and started to recruit more and more police women instead of just changing anything else. Like, you see, okay, like we have seen this like also in other cases, this attitude of the state. If you want me to recognize gender differences, I will recognize them, but in my own ways. And this like making the state to recognize gender differences, therefore gender needs based on gender differences, has its own controversies in a state which is also like in Turkey, where a state does also act after gender complementarity, after the idea that gender differences are important. So therefore, these, of course, modes of feminist interventions are very important. They differ a lot, but state responses are also accordingly the power effect of these encounters should not be underestimated. Yeah.
Interesting that you talk about the sort of the recruitment of more women into the police force. I mean, Sevgi has written about the recruitment of women by the Diyanet, of the Presidency of Religious Affairs, as a new not as a liberation or accepting of sort of gender equality, but actually as part of a very conservative agenda. So it's interesting that it's been sort of replicated in different parts of the state, essentially. I'm just going to see what other questions. And Sevgi says, thanks for the clarification. What shall we take from this analysis then in terms of feminist strategies? Would you argue that, for example, certain type of interventions are more effective than the others or less distortable?
Yes, thanks for this excellent question. This is also like the question which occupies me most since I wrote this book, because but what I come to the conclusion is that there are some more in-depth interventions, in the sense that there should be certain interventions directly to the systems of valorization. So whose body, whose labor, without changing the systems or the fights or the conflicts of valorization there. I guess the state will be always able to repurposify or resignify the feminist interventions. I know this sounds very much structuralist. I know this sounds against the idea that the state is itself is the condensation of social struggles. So what we do does matter. Of course it does matter. But what I've seen throughout this process, it was very easy for the state to repurposify all these because the woman's value in many ways in Turkey, especially quote unquote market value, I would say, is incredibly low when you compare it to the OECD countries, for example. So this creates still a significant issue, which is underestimated, I guess, a little bit in the feminist interventions, if you ask my idea, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Zuhra Emanet, who's actually going to be publishing in the same series on the question of gender and educational transformation in Turkey. She asks, thank you and congratulations, Funda. It's a very timely and very important topic. I'm interested in reforms on the juvenile justice system and emergence of community police projects across the country, although school policing practices in my work. Funda, you argued that you saw continuity rather than a rupture in terms of police reforms. How do you see juvenile justice system reforms within the entire police reform processes?
Thanks for this wonderful question as well. Well, for just be to the point, I haven't researched on the juvenile justice system until so far. So whatever I will say will be more about the state of children during the police reform process, because children also, interestingly, were very much subject or object of police science during the reform process. And what we see especially is the development of, this is what I know from my previous studies, a development of certain specific community policing projects regarding children. And as these were when I was writing on this topic, these community policing projects regarding the children, these were mostly focusing on, quote unquote, creating certain kinds of individuals out of children, especially out of Kurdish children in Southeast Turkey. And what we see at the time, community policing was understood as a mode of upbringing in certain, children in certain ways, so that they do not become quote unquote terrorists. And those those projects were very much obsessed by the idea that there are in-person encounters between the police and the children in southeastern Turkey. If you remember, there were some time this discussion on children throwing stones to the police officers in southeastern Turkey. That was a hotly topic by then during the police reform time in mid-2000s. And they were obsessed with the idea that how to make us lovable for these children, why they had hate police as such. And what we see is it's tremendous investment on the side of the police into social servicing, the creation of after school education times guided by police teachers. And the children were asked to attend these sessions where police were involved in teaching them maths or whatever, I don't know. And the children were gathered together. They were brought to all over the Turkey for different, I don't know, they were brought to for example, Çanakkale, so that they see the Ottoman heritage during from the Gallipoli War, I would say, so and so forth. So there was this kind of a social servicing idea, and the idea that through this social servicing, community policing, the children would be like good individuals. Let me say so. This is all I know about this policy reform process concerning the children, but I don't know about the specificities of the juvenile system, which is another story I know very much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Funda. We have another question from Özlem Baykal. In what direction do you think the perspective on feminism in Turkey will move forward? If critical Islamic rule seems like to continue in Turkey, how normal does it seem for women to realize themselves in matters such as security, individual life, and employment?
Oh, this is a very big question, I think, and I'm not sure I should be the answering one. I'm a poor academic here, not, but it's a very relevant question. Not to say like otherwise, but I mean, this is the I think problem about the analysis of political Islam. When we start to like do analysis of political Islam, we tend to be obsessed. We tend to reduce political Islam to political Islam. I'm sure Ceren maybe you can better answer this question, but what I try to say is that political Islam is not only about political Islam. So political Islam has a certain specific understanding of state, certain specific understanding of society, and they are trying to deal with those, with this understanding. They are trying to regulate the crisis of social reproduction, for example, in Turkey currently. There's a crisis of social reproduction. The unemployment rate among urban women hit 55%. This is an like tremendous number. And is this because of political Islam only? I'm not sure. The question, I guess, is more complex than that, if you ask my idea. I don't want to relativize the importance of political Islam, not at all. But what I try to say is that there is a complexity which should be taken in its complexity. We cannot just, I think, cherry pick here. I don't know. Yeah.
That's a very huge question indeed. Any further questions? Let me see. Yeah. We have Zuhra has just responded to say thank you. We currently have no further questions. Just give everyone a minute if anyone else has any further questions before we close. We're near the end in any case. And if Funda has any further bits you'd like to highlight about your book, I'll just remind everyone that yeah, BIA members have the 35% discount on the books. I know they're pricey, but all worth it. Excellent bunch of books, and remind everyone about October's event.
Okay, yeah, well, I think something to conclude with, maybe again another invitation for I think for the last decades since 1990s, the feminists, not the feminists, feminists were pretty much involved with this question: what should the state do? I think this is not a correct question. I think it is time to ask, what kind of a state do the feminists want to build? So I think what should the state do question does not help very much to go beyond, like it helps the state to buy time, I think, because I don't know, it's time, I guess, to progress with certain concrete utopias, which is happening around the world a lot nowadays. And I don't understand how come that in this respect, Turkish political scene is poorer. And this, I don't know why it has happened. So maybe it's because of this regime radar, talking only about the regime, maybe, I don't know. So, but yeah, there is a serious issue there, I think, and it's beyond my capability to solve it, of course.
We have a last minute question, which is from Sevgi. She says, why is there not an authoritarian turn? Can you explain a bit more? Maybe just the last minute or two.
Okay. I'm not saying that people didn't experience this period, especially after the Gezi period, in more violent terms. I'm not saying that the state power was more autocratic, more abrupt, more brutal. I'm not saying this. What I'm trying to say that all these arguments on authoritarian turn more or less argue that there was a good old days, there was this liberal democratic period where we were happier and where we were thinking that things were going okay. And all of a sudden, what has happened, the presidential system came, or Erdogan started to act after a lust of power. So the power perspective of Erdogan made him blind to any other thing. He started to just become autocratic, so on and so forth. I think the story cannot be that easy. I mean, there is no turn in this regard, if you ask my idea. It's not about the lust of power, lust of Erdogan. It's not about this, I don't know, because they don't want to go. Like this idea that this regime survival has been determining everything. Of course, regime survival, or however you call it, of course, this reflex to stay in power, I cannot deny it. But what I try to show you is that there were no good old days, and there were no cosmetic changes. There were real processes, and those who want to make sense of the authoritarian turn should revisit the liberal resources of this period. This is my argument, actually. Yeah.
Great. I think we're just at the end. I'll just check if there's anything else I have missed. No. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Funda, for your excellent presentation and your empirically and theoretically rich, excellent book, which is so important and so timely. And you know, congratulations. I'm very happy that you've published with the BIAA.
Well, thanks, Jen, and thank you for all of those who made time to sit through this presentation. I'm grateful. Thanks.
Thank you to the audience as well for the excellent questions. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.